When I woke from my coma, the nurse handed me a letter. My mother-in-law, Corinne, had packed up my belongings from Blackwater Estate, claiming my husband Victor would need space to grieve and move on. The family lawyer was coming tomorrow to discuss transitional arrangements for my departure. I should have been devastated, but instead, I smiled. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My fingers traced the edge of the pendant hidden beneath my hospital gown, the one containing the micro SD card with 3 years of recorded conversations. Corinne Westbrook had finally made her move, exactly as I'd anticipated. She just didn't realize that according to Victor's grandfather's original will, I didn't just have a right to live at Blackwater Estate. I owned it entirely. 6 years ago, I met Victor Finley at a charity gala in Stone Creek Valley. I was working as an architectural preservationist, dedicated to saving historic buildings from developers. Victor was the heir to Blackwater Estate, one of the oldest properties in Valerian County, and he'd been intrigued by my passionate speech about heritage conservation. Our romance blossomed quickly. Victor was charming, thoughtful, and shared my love for historical architecture. When he proposed after 8 months, I was caught in a whirlwind of happiness. What I didn't fully grasp then was that I wasn't just marrying Victor, I was marrying into the Westbrook Finley dynasty, a family whose wealth and influence stretched back generations in the Blue Ridge Mountains. My first meeting with my future mother-in-law at Blackwater Estate should have been a warning. Corinne Westbrook Finley stood at the top of the grand staircase, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled into a perfect chignon, her eyes assessing every detail of my appearance. "Margot, what an unusual name," she said, descending the stairs with practiced grace. "Victor tells me you work in building preservation?" The subtle emphasis made my profession sound like a quaint hobby. "Historic architectural preservation," I corrected gently. "Currently, I'm working on the Valerian County Courthouse restoration." "How fascinating," she replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I suppose every community needs its enthusiasts." That evening, over dinner in the cavernous dining room where portraits of Westbrook ancestors stared down disapprovingly, I noticed how Victor's demeanor changed in his mother's presence. His usual animated conversation became measured and formal. He deferred to her on topics he normally held strong opinions about. "The East Wing renovation should be completed by summer," he mentioned. Corinne's perfectly manicured nails tapped against her crystal wine glass. "The East Wing can wait. I've already spoken with Lawrence about prioritizing the gardens for the summer benefit." Victor simply nodded. "Of course, Mother. Whatever you think is best." After dinner, Lawrence Westbrook, Victor's stepfather, gave me a tour of the estate grounds. I admired the Georgian architecture of the main house, the careful restoration work done on the original features. Victor's grandfather, Julian, had a particular vision for Blackwater, Lawrence explained. He believed heritage wasn't just about preservation, but about evolution, allowing each generation to leave their mark while honoring what came before. "That's exactly my philosophy in preservation work," I said excitedly. Lawrence studied me with unexpected warmth. "Julian would have liked you, Margot. He was always concerned about who would truly care for Blackwater's legacy." Later that night, in Victor's childhood bedroom, I noticed a photograph of a white-haired man standing beside a much younger Victor. "Is that your grandfather?" I asked. Victor's expression softened. "Yes, Grandfather Julian. He raised me after my father died. Mother was struggling then." His voice held a note of sadness. "He was the heart of Blackwater. Everything changed after he passed." "When did he die?" I asked. 5 years ago, but sometimes it feels like yesterday." Victor turned away, but not before I caught the shine of tears in his eyes. Our wedding 3 months later was an elaborate affair orchestrated entirely by Corinne. My modest suggestions were politely acknowledged and promptly ignored. I wanted a ceremony in the estate's historic chapel. Corinne insisted on the grand ballroom. I preferred wildflowers from the estate gardens. She ordered exotic arrangements from a premier florist in the city. "Darling, this isn't just your wedding," Corinne explained when I expressed frustration to Victor. "This is a Westbrook-Finley union, a social and business occasion. There are expectations." Victor squeezed my hand apologetically. "Mother means well. She's just used to managing these things." On our wedding day, as I prepared in one of Blackwater's guest suites, Corinne visited with a small velvet box. "A gift," she said, opening it to reveal an antique pearl necklace. "Westbrook brides have worn these pearls for generations." As she fastened them around my neck, her fingers lingered by my throat. "Family tradition is sacred here, Margot. The Westbrooks have always understood that individuals serve the family, not the other way around." Her eyes met mine in the mirror. "I hope you'll adapt well to our ways." Life at Blackwater after the honeymoon settled into a strange rhythm. Though Victor and I had our own wing of the house, Corinne seemed omnipresent. She arranged our social calendar, selected the staff who worked in our section of the house, and presided over family dinners with rigid formality. I tried establishing my place in the household, suggesting updates to some of the deteriorating historical features, offering to use my professional connections to enhance the property's historical registry status. Each suggestion was met with the same response from Corinne. "Blackwater has managed quite well for generations without outside intervention, dear. Perhaps focus on being a good wife to Victor for now." 4 months into our marriage, I discovered Vivienne Pascal, the estate manager, examining the foundation in the rarely used north wing. "Moisture damage," she explained, showing me the concerning deterioration. "I've been trying to get Mrs. Westbrook to approve repairs for months, but she insists there are no funds available for this section." "That's strange," I said. "Victor mentioned the estate trust has dedicated preservation funds." Vivienne's expression turned guarded. "Did he? That's interesting, because I've been told repeatedly that the preservation fund was depleted years ago." That evening, I asked Victor about the trust funds. His response was oddly evasive. "Mother handles all the financial arrangements with Lawrence. It's always been that way." "But shouldn't you be involved? Especially with your background in finance?" Victor's expression clouded. "Mother thinks it's better if I focus on other aspects of the family business. She says I'm too sentimental about Blackwater to make objective financial decisions." The conversation ended when Corinne interrupted, announcing unexpected dinner guests. But something had shifted in my understanding of Blackwater Estate and my place within it. In the coming weeks, I began paying closer attention to the dynamics around me. I noticed how Victor deferred to Corinne on virtually every decision. How Lawrence, despite his senior position at Hargrove Holdings, the family investment firm, always yielded to Corinne's judgment regarding Blackwater. How staff members who had worked at the estate for decades seemed unusually guarded when Corinne was present. Small inconsistencies began to emerge. Renovations would be announced, then mysteriously canceled. Historic furniture would disappear, replaced with reproductions. Financial decisions about the estate were made without Victor's knowledge, despite his official position as the heir. One afternoon, while searching for a book in the library, I discovered a hidden drawer in the antique desk, Victor's grandfather's desk. Inside was a sealed envelope addressed to "My grandson, Victor, to be opened upon your 30th birthday." Victor had turned 32 years ago. I didn't open the letter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead, I noted its existence and location, and began to wonder what other secrets Blackwater might be hiding from its rightful heir. My architectural training had taught me to look beyond facades, to understand the true structures that supported grand exteriors. Now I began applying those same principles to the Westbrook-Finley dynasty. Behind the impressive facade of family unity and tradition, what was the actual foundation? And was it as compromised as the North Wing's crumbling stonework? That night, I made a decision. I would not confront Corinne directly. That would only lead to denials and potentially put me at risk. Instead, I would document, investigate, and build a complete understanding of what was happening at Blackwater Estate. If there were secrets being kept from Victor, he deserved to know the truth about his inheritance and his family. The next day, I purchased a small recording device disguised as a pendant necklace. I also began keeping meticulous notes in a coded digital journal, storing everything in encrypted cloud storage that only I could access. My investigation into the true nature of Blackwater Estate had begun. I started my documentation methodically, beginning with the estate's architectural history, my professional specialty and a natural interest that wouldn't raise suspicions. Corinne actually seemed pleased by my newfound interest in Blackwater's heritage, perhaps viewing it as my finally accepting my role as a Westbrook-Finley wife. "The archives are in the East Wing," she informed me over breakfast one morning. "Though I'm afraid they're rather disorganized. No one has properly cataloged them since Julian became ill." The archives proved to be a treasure trove, not just of architectural plans and historical photographs, but of family documents, financial records, correspondence, legal paperwork spanning generations, all gathering dust in mahogany filing cabinets, apparently forgotten. I began organizing these documents under the guise of creating a proper historical archive for the estate. Each evening, I would photograph critical pages, particularly those relating to Julian Finley's management of Blackwater and the changes implemented after his death. What emerged was troubling. Julian had established a substantial trust specifically for Blackwater's preservation, with Victor named as the primary trustee upon reaching 30 years of age. Yet according to Vivienne, this fund was supposedly depleted. Where had the money gone? My pendant recorder captured dozens of conversations over the coming months, Corinne instructing the household staff to redirect my questions, Lawrence making cryptic references to alternative investments of the preservation funds. Most disturbing were the private conversations between Corinne and Victor, where her subtle manipulation was most evident. "You're so like your father, darling," she would say whenever he questioned her decisions. "Brilliant but impractical. That's why he left the estate in such financial trouble when he died. Thank goodness I was able to step in." Victor's response was always the same: retreat, deference, apology. The pattern was so consistent, it seemed almost programmed. What had happened to the confident, passionate man I had fallen in love with? 6 months into my investigation, I made 2 significant discoveries. First, in reviewing medical records, stored among Julian's personal papers, I found references to Victor's treatment following his father's death. The documents were vague, but mentioned a Dr. Elijah Nolan and a regimen of what were described as stabilizing medications prescribed when Victor was just 14. Second, I found discrepancies in the legal documents regarding Blackwater's ownership. The versions in the family's main files showed Corinne as the primary trustee of the estate, with Victor as beneficiary upon reaching certain milestones, marriage being one, turning 30 another. But deeper in the archives, I discovered earlier drafting documents with Julian's handwritten notes. These suggested a very different arrangement. Victor would gain full control of Blackwater upon turning 30, with a secondary provision that, if he married before that time, his spouse would become joint trustee, specifically to prevent any single person from having unilateral control over the estate's resources. Had the final will been altered? I needed to find the original. My search became more focused, but also more dangerous. Corinne began noticing my interest in family documents. "You're spending so much time in those dusty archives," she remarked one afternoon, appearing unexpectedly in the doorway. "One might think you're looking for something specific." "Just organizing," I replied casually. "Did you know the original architectural plans for the North Wing restoration are missing? I thought they might help explain the current structural issues." "Those old papers are hardly relevant now," she said dismissively. "Lawrence and I are considering more dramatic changes for that section of the house." "What kind of changes?" I asked, keeping my tone merely curious. "We've had interest from a developer who specializes in converting historic properties into luxury hotel experiences. The North Wing would make a beautiful boutique hotel, don't you think?" My heart sank. The North Wing contained some of Blackwater's most historically significant features. Converting it would destroy irreplaceable architectural elements, and likely violate the preservation covenants I suspected Julian had established. "Does Victor know about these plans?" I asked. Corinne's smile tightened. "Victor understands that Blackwater must evolve to survive financially. Not everything can remain frozen in time, Margot, no matter how much preservationists might wish it." That evening, I shared Corinne's hotel conversion plans with Victor, hoping to spark his protective instincts for his grandfather's legacy. Instead, he seemed resigned. "Mother says the preservation funds are depleted. We have to find alternative ways to maintain Blackwater." "But what about the trusts your grandfather established?" I pressed. "According to the archives, there should be substantial funds dedicated solely to maintenance and restoration." Victor's expression changed, a flash of confusion quickly replaced by practiced certainty. "You must be mistaken. Mother has managed the finances since grandfather died. If those funds existed, she would have told me." Later that night, I heard them talking in Victor's study. Corinne's voice low but intense, Victor's responses becoming increasingly submissive. My pendant recorder captured it all. Corinne's subtle reminders of Victor's fragile condition after his father's death, her insistence that the medications Dr. Nolan prescribed were still necessary for his stability, her warnings about the dangers of becoming fixated on the past, like his grandfather. I began researching Dr. Elijah Nolan. He wasn't listed in any medical directories, but I eventually found references to him in connection with an exclusive treatment center called Meridian Behavioral Institute, which specialized in behavioral modification for exceptional young adults. Meanwhile, I continued searching for Julian's original will. If my suspicions were correct, it would be the key to understanding what had really happened after his death, and potentially to protecting Blackwater from Corinne's plans. 18 months into my marriage, during a rare weekend when Corinne and Lawrence were away attending a benefit in the city, I made a breakthrough. Vivienne Pascal, who had become a cautious ally, mentioned a hidden safe in Julian's old study, now used as a storage room. Mr. Julian was very private about certain documents, she explained. He didn't trust banks for his most important papers, said family matters should stay within the family walls. The safe was concealed behind a false panel in the fireplace surround. It took hours of careful inspection to locate it, and I had no way to open it. But now I knew where to look when the opportunity arose. That opportunity came 3 months later when I discovered the combination in a coded note tucked into Julian's personal Bible, the numbers corresponding to birth dates of Finley ancestors. With Corinne occupied hosting the garden club and Victor attending a business meeting in the city, I finally accessed the safe. Inside was the original will, exactly as I suspected. According to Julian's true wishes, Victor had inherited full control of Blackwater on his 30th birthday 2 years ago. More significantly, there was a codicil stating that if Victor married, his spouse would become joint trustee with equal control over the estate, a safeguard Julian had implemented out of concern for undue influence over his grandson. By the Legal terms of the original will, I had been co-owner of Blackwater Estate since the day I married Victor. Also in the safe were medical records documenting the treatments administered to Victor after his father's death. Treatments that appeared to be a combination of powerful anti-anxiety medications and what was described as compliance therapy. The records were signed by Dr. Nolan and authorized by Corinne as Victor's guardian. I photographed everything, encrypted the files, and returned the documents to the safe. That same day, I contacted Maxwell Hargrove, a lawyer not connected to the family, sending him copies of what I'd discovered without revealing my full suspicions. "I'd like an independent legal opinion on these documents," I explained. "Hypothetically speaking, what would their implications be if they were authentic?" Hargrove's response confirmed my worst fears. If these are indeed authentic, they suggest a clear case of will suppression and potential medical battery against the heir. The original trustee would have been legally obligated to transfer control according to these terms. Failure to do so constitutes fraud. Over the next year, I expanded my investigation, documenting every aspect of Corinne's management of Blackwater. The diverted preservation funds, the forged authorizations, the continued treatments administered to Victor under the guise of managing an anxiety condition that had been deliberately induced during his vulnerable teenage years. My pendant recorder captured dozens of incriminating conversations. My encrypted files grew to include financial records, showing how the preservation funds had been channeled into Corinne and Lawrence's personal investment accounts. I documented the systematic isolation of Victor from his grandfather's old allies and advisors. I was building an ironclad case, but I still hadn't determined how to use it. Direct confrontation seemed dangerous. Corinne had already proven her willingness to manipulate and control anyone who threatened her position. And Victor, still under the influence of both psychological conditioning and medication, might not be ready to accept the truth. Then came the accident that nearly derailed everything, and ultimately provided the perfect catalyst. It happened during my inspection of the deteriorating North Wing foundation. A section of flooring collapsed, sending me crashing 15 feet into the old cellar. I suffered a concussion, a broken arm, and internal bleeding that required emergency surgery. The doctors placed me in a medically induced coma to reduce brain swelling. I spent 3 weeks unconscious at Meridian General Hospital. During that time, according to the nurses, Corinne visited regularly, the picture of a concerned mother-in-law. Victor came daily, distraught and increasingly sedated as the weeks passed. What Corinne didn't know was that I had prepared for contingencies. My friend Daphne Carter, a fellow preservationist who had grown suspicious of the Westbrooks, had instructions to monitor my cloud storage and contact Maxwell Hargrove if I didn't check in every 72 hours. When I finally regained consciousness, the nurse handed me a sealed note that had been left by Corinne. "Your mother-in-law asked us to give you this when you woke up," she explained. "She said it was important you had time to process it before she visited again." The note was coldly efficient. While I was unconscious, Corinne had packed my personal belongings and moved them to storage. She expressed concern about my accident occurring in a restricted area of the house where I had no authority to be. She suggested that upon my recovery, we should discuss appropriate living arrangements, as Victor found my obsession with estate matters distressing, and he needed space to process this trauma. The family lawyer would be visiting tomorrow to discuss these transitional arrangements. I carefully folded the note and asked the nurse for my personal effects. My pendant was there, the micro SD card still safely hidden inside its secret compartment. My phone had several missed calls from Daphne and Maxwell Hargrove. When the nurse left, I called Hargrove immediately. "Thank God," he said when he heard my voice. "We were about to file emergency interventions. Your friend Daphne has been monitoring the situation at Blackwater. It's worse than we thought." Hargrove explained that during my coma, Corinne had taken complete control of the narrative. She'd told everyone that my accident occurred because I was unstable and obsessively searching for non-existent documents. She'd restricted Victor's hospital visits and increased his medication, claiming, "The stress of my accident had triggered an episode similar to his teenage breakdown." Most alarmingly, she'd begun the process of having me declared mentally incompetent, using the obsessive behavior leading to my accident as evidence. The transitional arrangements mentioned in her note were likely the first step toward institutionalization, possibly at the same Meridian Behavioral Institute where Victor had been treated as a teenager. "We need to move quickly," Hargrove advised. "Based on the documentation you provided, I've prepared legal filings to contest the altered will and establish your rightful position as co-trustee of Blackwater. But Corinne is already mobilizing her resources." "When is she planning to visit the hospital?" I asked. "Tomorrow afternoon, according to Daphne's intelligence. She's bringing the family lawyer and possibly Dr. Nolan." "Perfect," I said. "That gives us time to set everything in motion. I want them to make their move publicly, with witnesses." The next morning, I asked the nursing staff to allow several visitors around the time of Corinne's expected arrival, specifically Daphne Carter and Maxwell Hargrove. I explained that I was expecting difficult family news and wanted my support system present. I also requested that my room be prepared for a family meeting with enough seating for everyone. The sympathetic hospital staff, who had grown suspicious of Corinne's controlling behavior during my coma, readily agreed. When Corinne arrived, accompanied by Lawrence, their family lawyer Theodore Walsh, and a distinguished silver-haired man I assumed was Dr. Nolan, they found not a vulnerable patient, ready for manipulation, but a fully alert woman sitting up in bed, flanked by her own lawyer and friend. Corinne recovered from her surprise quickly. "Margot, I see you're feeling better. How unexpected to find you with visitors. We have private family matters to discuss." "I thought it best to have my own representation present," I replied, calmly, "since you've brought yours." Corinne's facade of concern hardened into something colder. "These are unnecessary complications. Victor is extremely distressed by your accident. The doctor has had to adjust his medication significantly. We're simply here to smooth the transition as you recover. Elsewhere." "You mean as I'm institutionalized for invented mental health issues?" I said, my voice steady. "Like Victor was after his father died?" Dr. Nolan stepped forward. "Mrs. Finley, in reviewing your case, I've noted concerning patterns consistent with obsessive fixation and paranoid ideation. Your unauthorized exploration of dangerous areas of the estate, despite explicit warnings." "You mean my professional inspection of architectural features I co-own?" I interrupted. Corinne's expression flickered. "You don't own anything at Blackwater. You're simply Victor's wife, and given his fragile condition." "Actually," Maxwell Hargrove interjected, opening his briefcase, "according to Julian Finley's original will, not the altered version your lawyer filed, Mrs. Margot Finley has been co-trustee and co-owner of Blackwater Estate since her marriage to Victor, a fact you've deliberately concealed while diverting millions from the Preservation Trust." Corinne's composure cracked. "That's absurd. The original will named me as trustee until Victor was prepared to assume responsibility." "Until he turned 30, I corrected, which happened 2 years ago. Or until he married, at which point his spouse would become co-trustee, a safeguard your father-in-law specifically implemented because he was concerned about your influence over Victor." The hospital room fell silent. Dr. Nolan shifted uncomfortably. Theodore Walsh looked genuinely confused, suggesting he might not have been aware of the will substitution. "These are serious allegations," Walsh said carefully. "If you have documentation." "We have the original will, discovered in Julian Finley's personal safe," Hargrove confirmed, along with medical records documenting the unnecessary treatments administered to Victor from age 14 onward. I reached for my pendant, removing the hidden micro-SD card. "We also have 3 years of recorded conversations documenting financial fraud, deliberate medical manipulation, and conspiracy to commit unlawful detention. Corinne lunged forward. "Give me that. You have no right to record private conversations." Lawrence grabbed her arm, his face ashen. "Corinne, stop. Think carefully about what you're doing." But Corinne was beyond caution now, her careful facade completely shattered. "Everything I did was to protect Blackwater. Victor was never strong enough to manage it properly, just like his father. Someone had to take control. By drugging your own son? By stealing millions from the Preservation Trust? By attempting to have your daughter-in-law committed when she discovered the truth?" I asked, each question landing like a physical blow. Dr. Nolan was already inching toward the door. Theodore Walsh looked horrified, clearly realizing he had been made complicit in potential criminal acts. Corinne's eyes narrowed to slits. "You think you've won? Victor will never believe you over me. His condition makes him completely dependent." "His condition is manufactured," interrupted a new voice from the doorway. Victor stood there, clearer-eyed than I had seen him in years. Beside him was Vivienne Pascal, the estate manager who had helped me access Julian's safe. "I've been reducing my medication for weeks, Mother," Victor said quietly. "Ever since Margot's accident, the fog has finally lifted enough for me to see what you've been doing." He stepped into the room, his posture straightening with each word. "Grandfather warned me about you before he died. I didn't understand then. I do now." The scene in the hospital room shifted dramatically with Victor's arrival. Corinne's carefully constructed world began to collapse in real time. "Victor, darling, you're confused," she attempted, her voice adopting the soothing tone she had always used to control him. "You know your condition requires careful management. Dr. Nolan has explained." "Dr. Nolan isn't even a licensed psychiatrist," Victor interrupted. "Vivian helped me investigate. His credentials were fabricated. The Meridian Behavioral Institute is a shell company you created to launder money from Grandfather's Preservation Trust." Theodore Walsh gathered his papers hastily. "I believe I should recuse myself from this situation immediately. It appears I've been provided with incomplete and potentially fraudulent information." He turned to Hargrove. "I had no knowledge of will substitution or fabricated medical credentials." "I assure you." Corinne's face contorted with rage. "You coward! After everything the family has done for your firm." Dr. Nolan had already slipped out during the confusion. Lawrence stood frozen, clearly calculating his own legal exposure. Victor approached my bedside, taking my hand gently. "I found your research notes after the accident. When Mother banned me from visiting you, I knew something was wrong. Vivian helped me access your cloud storage with the emergency password you'd given her." "You've been investigating my mother for 3 years," he continued, his voice a mixture of admiration and regret, "while I was too medicated to see what was happening right in front of me." Hargrove seized the momentum. "We've filed emergency injunctions freezing all assets associated with Blackwater Estate. We've also submitted the original will for authentication and petitioned for immediate enforcement of its terms." Lawrence finally spoke, his businessman's instincts for self-preservation taking over. "I believe there may have been some misunderstandings about financial allocations. As Corinne's husband, I had no direct access to the trust documentation. I simply managed investments as directed." "Save it for your deposition, Lawrence," Victor said coldly. "The financial records show your signature on dozens of fraudulent transfers." Corinne made one last desperate attempt. "Victor, everything I did was for you. Your father would have destroyed our legacy with his reckless management. I had to take control to preserve Blackwater for future generations. By destroying its historical features for a boutique hotel? By drugging me into compliance? By trying to institutionalize my wife when she discovered the truth?" Victor's voice grew stronger with each question. "That's not preservation, Mother. That's destruction motivated by greed and control." Daphne, who had been quietly recording the entire confrontation, caught my eye and nodded. Another piece of evidence documented. Corinne saw the exchange and lunged at Daphne. "Give me that phone. You have no right." Hospital security, alerted by the commotion, appeared in the doorway. 2 uniformed officers accompanied them. "Is there a problem?" "Here?" one of the officers asked. Maxwell Hargrove stepped forward. "Officers, we'd like to report multiple crimes including fraud, financial exploitation, conspiracy, and medical battery. We have documentation ready for your review." As Corinne was escorted from the room, still protesting her innocence and threatening legal consequences, the carefully maintained illusion of Westbrook family perfectionism shattered completely. Hospital staff who had witnessed the confrontation exchanged shocked glances. Lawrence, abandoned by Walsh and seeing no path to self-preservation, followed the officers willingly, already offering to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Within hours, news of the Westbrook-Finley scandal began spreading through Valerian County. By evening, it had reached regional news outlets. Within days, it would become a national story about wealth, exploitation, and decades of manipulation finally exposed. 6 months after my hospital confrontation with Corinne, I stood on Blackwater's restored north wing balcony, watching autumn leaves drift across the estate grounds. My arm had healed, though I still experienced occasional headaches from the concussion. The physical recovery had been straightforward compared to the emotional and legal aftermath of exposing Corinne's decades of manipulation. Victor joined me, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders against the October chill. He looked younger. Somehow, the perpetual tension in his features replaced by a new calmness. "The prosecution offered Corinne a plea deal today," he said quietly. 15 years with possibility of parole after 10, in exchange for full financial disclosure and testimony against her co-conspirators. "Will she take it?" I asked. "Her lawyer thinks she should. The evidence is overwhelming." He sighed. Lawrence has already accepted a similar arrangement. 5 years in exchange for his testimony. I leaned against the stone balustrade, considering how completely the Westbrook-Finley dynasty had collapsed. Once loyal family associates had distanced themselves or turned state's evidence. The family's social standing had evaporated overnight. The carefully cultivated image of aristocratic perfection had been revealed as a facade, concealing decades of exploitation and fraud. "What about Dr. Nolan?" I asked. "Arrested in Canada last week. He's facing charges related to practicing medicine without a license, medical battery, and conspiracy." The investigation had revealed that Nolan was actually Thomas Wilkins, a failed psychology student who had been employed by Corinne for years, posing as a medical professional to administer unnecessary medications to Victor and other family members who questioned her authority. Victor's recovery from years of psychological manipulation and unnecessary medication had been remarkably swift once he was free from Corinne's influence. The anxiety condition that had allegedly required management since his teenage years had largely dissipated within months of stopping the medications. "The Foundation Board approved all our restoration proposals," Victor said, changing the subject to something more hopeful. "The North Wing will be fully restored according to grandfather's original plans by next summer." The Julian Finley Historic Preservation Foundation had been our first initiative after securing control of Blackwater. Using recovered funds from Corinne's fraudulent accounts, we had established a protected trust dedicated to preserving historic properties throughout Valerian County, with Blackwater as its flagship project. "And the educational program?" I asked. Victor smiled. 15 architecture students will begin their preservation residencies next month. Vivian has their accommodations ready in the East Wing. Transforming portions of Blackwater into an educational center for architectural preservation students had been Julian's unrealized dream, one we had discovered in his personal papers. Now it would become reality, creating a legacy far more meaningful than the boutique hotel Corinne had envisioned. Inside the house, I could hear the preservationists at work, carefully restoring original features that had been neglected or deliberately damaged during Corinne's tenure. The sounds of reconstruction, hammers tapping, voices calling measurements, the occasional burst of laughter, brought the old house to life in ways it hadn't experienced in decades. "Sometimes I still can't believe what she did," Victor said, softly. "My own mother." I took his hand. This was the hardest part of recovery, accepting that someone who should have protected him had instead exploited his vulnerability for power and financial gain. "She couldn't see Blackwater the way your grandfather did, as a living heritage to be shared and preserved. She only saw it as a possession to control. While you saw it as something to protect, even at great personal risk," Victor said, turning to face me. "You could have left when you discovered what was happening. Instead, you spent years gathering evidence, knowing the dangers." The decision to stay and document rather than flee had been complex. Initially, it was about protecting the historic estate I had fallen in love with. Then, as I uncovered the extent of Victor's manipulation, it became about justice and recovery for him, for Blackwater, and for others who had been harmed by Corinne's schemes. "I couldn't abandon what your grandfather tried to protect," I said simply. "Or you." Inside the house, a phone rang. Victor answered it, listened briefly, then turned to me with a smile. "That was Maxwell. The court has officially approved our historic covenant application. Blackwater is now permanently protected from development. No future owner can ever convert it or substantially alter its historical features. This had been our most important legal battle, ensuring that what had happened under Corinne's management could never happen again. No matter who owned Blackwater in the future, its historical integrity would be legally protected in perpetuity." As the sun began to set over the Blue Ridge Mountains, casting the estate in golden light, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. From my first suspicions to the meticulous documentation, from my near-fatal accident to the confrontation that finally exposed decades of manipulation, each step had been necessary to reclaim both Blackwater's legacy and Victor's autonomy. "There's one more thing," Victor said, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "The restoration team found this behind a panel in Grandfather's study. It's addressed to both of us." The envelope contained a letter written in Julian Finley's distinctive handwriting, apparently concealed shortly before his death. "To my grandson Victor and his future partner," it began. "If you're reading this, you've discovered the truth I feared would be hidden after my passing. Corinne's influence over this family has always been motivated by control rather than care. I've tried to create safeguards to protect you and Blackwater's legacy, but I fear they may not be enough against her determination." The letter continued, explaining Julian's concerns about the psychological manipulation he had observed, his attempts to document the unauthorized treatments Victor had received, and his hope that Victor would find a partner strong enough to help break Corinne's control. "Blackwater isn't just stone and timber," the letter concluded. "It's a living testament to our values, preservation balanced with innovation, respect for history alongside openness to change. I trust you to honor this balance in ways Corinne never could. The true legacy of Blackwater isn't in its walls, but in the integrity of those who protect it." Victor's eyes shimmered with tears as he carefully folded the letter. He knew. All this time, he knew what was happening and tried to protect me. "And he succeeded," I said gently. "Not immediately, but eventually. Through you, through the will, through creating structures that allowed the truth to emerge." 2 weeks later, we hosted the first public tour of Blackwater since reclaiming control of the estate. Local historical societies, preservation students, and community members who had known Julian walked through the partially restored rooms, exclaiming over architectural details that had been hidden or neglected during Corinne's tenure. Among the visitors was Terrence Finley, Victor's estranged uncle who had been systematically excluded from family gatherings after questioning Corinne's management of the estate years ago. "You've accomplished what many of us tried and failed to do," Terence told me as we stood in the library where I had first discovered Julian's hidden safe. Corinne was masterful at isolating anyone who challenged her. One by one, Julian's allies were pushed away, our concerns dismissed as jealousy or instability. "It took an outsider," I acknowledged. "Someone she couldn't control through shared history or family loyalty." "And exceptional patience," Terence added. "Lesser people would have confronted her immediately or simply left." The patience had been crucial. Had I confronted Corinne directly when I first discovered discrepancies, I would likely have been discredited, perhaps even subjected to the same kind of treatment Victor had endured. By methodically building a comprehensive case over years, I had ensured that when the confrontation finally came, it was decisive. As the evening concluded, visitors gathered in the newly restored Grand Hall, where Victor announced the establishment of the Blackwater Preservation Scholarship, an annual grant for students specializing in historic restoration, with preference given to those focusing on properties with preservation challenges. My grandfather believed that preservation isn't just about maintaining physical structures, but about protecting the values and principles they embody. Victor told the assembled crowd, "This scholarship honors his vision by supporting the next generation of preservationists who understand that heritage is both a gift to honor and a responsibility to uphold." Later that night, after the last guests had departed, Victor and I walked the grounds of Blackwater, the path lit by the same antique lanterns that had guided Julian Finley decades earlier. "You know what's ironic?" Victor said as we paused. "By the rose garden his grandfather had planted. All those years, Mother claimed to be preserving Blackwater's legacy while actually destroying it. You actually preserved it while appearing to threaten her control. True preservation requires understanding what's worth protecting and what needs to evolve," I replied. "Your grandfather understood that. Corinne never did." 1 year after my accident, the criminal trials concluded with guilty verdicts for Corinne, Lawrence, and their key accomplices. The financial recovery team had traced and reclaimed over $12 million in misappropriated trust funds, money now being used to establish preservation projects throughout the region. But the most meaningful outcome wasn't measured in legal victories or financial recoveries. It was visible in the renewed vibrancy of Blackwater itself. Historic features that had been neglected or deliberately hidden were now restored. Spaces that had been unused for decades now bustled with activity as students and preservationists worked side by side. In the newly renovated North Wing, the section where my near-fatal accident had occurred, we established the Julian Finley Research Center, dedicated to documenting and preserving at-risk historic properties throughout the Blue Ridge region. The center's first project was creating a comprehensive guide for identifying and legally protecting historically significant buildings vulnerable to development pressure. Victor, freed from both medication and manipulation, rediscovered his passion for architectural history, an interest Corinne had systematically discouraged as impractical. He now taught regular workshops for preservation students, sharing the knowledge of Blackwater's construction and history that his grandfather had passed to him. As for me, I continued my preservation work with a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to protect a legacy. Sometimes preservation wasn't just about buildings, but about the human values they represented. Sometimes the most important elements to protect were invisible to the eye, the stories, principles, and truths embedded within the visible structure. 2 years after Corinne's conviction, I stood in Julian Finley's restored study, now a warm, welcoming space rather than the storage room Corinne had relegated it to. On the wall hung a simple framed quote from Julian's letter. "The true legacy of Blackwater isn't in its walls, but in the integrity of those who protect it." Victor entered, carrying architectural plans for the spring garden restoration. The Historical Society just confirmed Blackwater has been designated a National Historic Landmark, the highest level of protection possible. I smiled, running my hand along the restored oak paneling that had witnessed generations of Finley family history, both the honorable chapters and the darker ones we had exposed. When your mother threw my things out while I was in the hospital, she thought she was finally eliminating the threat to her control, I reflected. She never understood that Blackwater itself was always the witness to her actions. The house kept its secrets until someone cared enough to listen. Victor nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. Grandfather used to say that old houses have memories longer than the people who live in them. He was right, I said, looking out the window at the estate stretching before us, now protected in perpetuity from those who would exploit rather than preserve it. And sometimes those memories are just waiting for the right person to hear them. The story of Blackwater Estate, of patient documentation, strategic timing, and justice finally served, became something of a legend in preservation circles. But for those of us who had lived through it, the lesson was deeply personal. True preservation wasn't just about maintaining physical structures, but about protecting the principles and truths they embodied, even when that protection required extraordinary patience and courage. Corinne had never understood that throwing out my belongings couldn't erase my connection to Blackwater, a connection that went beyond legal ownership to something deeper, a shared commitment to preserving not just a historic estate, but the values of truth and integrity it represented. In the end, that commitment had proven stronger than all of Corinne's manipulation, deception, and control. And Blackwater, with its stone foundations and timber beams, its hidden safes and secret passages, stood as testament to an enduring truth. Patience and documentation are often the most powerful tools against those who would distort history for their own gain. 15 years after reclaiming Blackwater Estate, I stood in the newly completed international wing of the Valerian Preservation Institute. What had begun as a modest educational program in Blackwater's restored North Wing had evolved into a globally recognized center for heritage conservation, drawing preservation specialists from around the world. The expansion had been Victor's vision, transforming our regional preservation efforts into an international exchange of restoration techniques, legal protection strategies, and community engagement methods. The Institute now hosted year-round residencies for preservation professionals addressing challenges from Venice's rising waters to earthquake damage in historic Japanese temples. The UNESCO representatives arrive tomorrow, Vivian reminded me as she joined me in the new lecture hall. Now, in her 60s but showing no signs of slowing down, she had transitioned from estate manager to the Institute's chief operations officer. The World Heritage Site Evaluation Committee wants a full tour of both the physical facilities and the digital preservation archives. UNESCO's interest represented the culmination of years of methodical work, the Valerian methodology for documenting and protecting vulnerable historic sites had gained international attention after successfully preserving dozens of at-risk properties throughout the American Southeast. Now, preservation specialists from heritage organizations worldwide were adopting our protocols for identifying legal vulnerabilities in protection status and systematically addressing them before physical deterioration became critical. Are the digital demonstration stations ready? I asked, examining the sleek multimedia displays that lined the hall's perimeter. Each station showcased a different aspect of Blackwater's transformation, from contested inheritance to preservation center, alongside case studies of properties saved through similar methodologies. All operational, Vivian confirmed. The team finished loading the comparative analysis of legal protection frameworks last night. 38 countries represented, with specific case studies for each major legal system. As we reviewed the final preparations, a young woman approached, one of the preservation fellows from the Institute's International Exchange Program. "Excuse me, Dr. Finley. The representatives from the Japanese Heritage Foundation have arrived early. They're particularly interested in your documentation methodology for establishing historic provenance when ownership records are contested. This request was unsurprising. The Institute had become especially known for its expertise in navigating disputed ownership claims, using methodical documentation to establish authentic provenance and protect vulnerable properties during ownership. Transitions. What had begun as my personal strategy for exposing Corinne's manipulation of Blackwater's ownership had evolved into a systematic approach taught to preservation specialists worldwide. "Please show them to the East Conference Room," I responded. "I'll join them shortly with the relevant materials." As the fellow departed, Victor entered from the main hallway, accompanied by Maxwell Hargrove. Though now in his 70s, our lawyer maintained an active advisory role with the Institute's legal education program. The Ministry of Cultural Heritage representatives just confirmed their participation in next month's symposium, Victor I announced. That makes 23 countries sending official governmental delegations, plus the NGOs and private foundation representatives. "The Valyrian methodology has gone truly global," Maxwell observed. "A far cry from our original goal of simply protecting Blackwater from Corinne's development plans." I smiled at this understatement. From one estate to an international preservation movement. Not the outcome I anticipated when I first discovered those discrepancies in Julian's financial records. We moved to my office, still located in what had been Julian's study, though now expanded to accommodate the increased administrative responsibilities of directing an international institute. The original architectural features remained intact, including the fireplace with its hidden safe that had once contained Julian's true will. Now the safe held digital backups of the Institute's most valuable preservation protocols and methodologies. The World Bank representatives were particularly impressed with the economic impact analysis, Victor noted as we reviewed the materials prepared for the UNESCO delegation. The data showing heritage preservation as a driver of sustainable economics development rather than an impediment to growth has shifted the conversation in developing regions. This had been one of our most significant contributions to global preservation efforts, demonstrating through rigorous economic analysis that properly managed historic properties could generate more sustainable economic benefits than demolition and redevelopment. The methodology had been developed using Blackwater and other properties protected under the Valyrian Initiative as case studies. Speaking of economic impact, Maxwell interjected, the quarterly report from the Julian Finley Medical Access Foundation arrived this morning. They've now supported over 500 families with extraordinary medical needs, with an economic offset value estimated at nearly $80 million. This parallel development remained one of the most meaningful outcomes of our work. The foundation, established using recovered funds from Corinne's fraudulent accounts, had expanded far beyond its original scope, creating a model program for addressing extraordinary medical needs that fell through the gaps of conventional insurance coverage. Eleanor Winter's daughter just completed her medical residency, Victor added with satisfaction, specializing in the very condition she herself was treated for through the Foundation's support. These full-circle moments continued to emerge as our work expanded. Eleanor Winters now served as the Institute's senior textile conservation specialist, training preservation fellows from around the world in techniques she had once feared would be lost when financial pressures nearly forced her to abandon her expertise. Our discussion was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Daphne Carter entered, her position at the National Trust for Historic Preservation having evolved into a formal partnership role with the Valyrian Institute. "Sorry to interrupt," she began. "But there's a situation I thought you should know about immediately. Lawrence Westbrook is attempting to insert himself into tomorrow's UNESCO visit." Victor tensed visibly at the mention of his stepfather. Lawrence had been released from prison 5 years earlier, having served his reduced sentence for cooperation with the prosecution. Since then, he had attempted repeatedly to rebrand himself as a preservation advocate, seeking to distance himself from his role in Corinne's manipulation of Blackwater. "What's his angle this time?" Victor asked, his voice tightening. "He's claiming that as a key figure in Blackwater's transition, he should be included in the formal presentation to the UNESCO committee," Daphne explained, making no attempt to hide her disgust. "He's leveraged connections at the State Department to get himself credentialed as an independent historic preservation consultant for the delegation's visit." "Absolutely not," I responded firmly. "His participation would undermine the entire narrative of Blackwater's transformation. He wasn't a catalyst for positive change. He was an active participant in the attempt to dismantle the estate's historic features for commercial development. Unfortunately, his State Department connections make this delicate," Maxwell cautioned. "A direct rejection could create diplomatic complications for the UNESCO evaluation process." "Then we don't reject him directly," Victor suggested, a strategic glint in his eye that reminded me of the man who had emerged from beneath Corinne's conditioning years ago. "We redirect him. The delegation is splitting into specialized groups, correct?" Daphne nodded. 4 tracks, focusing on different aspects of the Institute's work. "Then we assign Lawrence to the Legal Compliance Documentation Group," Victor proposed. "It's the most technically complex presentation, focused entirely on the evidentiary standards required for establishing historic provenance in contested ownership situations." I immediately saw the elegant strategy in this approach. "The very methodology we developed to expose his and Corinne's manipulation of Blackwater's ownership records." "Exactly," Victor confirmed. "He can hardly object to the assignment without acknowledging why it's inappropriate for him specifically. And if he does attend, he'll be forced to sit through a detailed explanation of exactly how we documented the fraud he participated in, with case studies and specific reference to the techniques used to conceal ownership transfers," I added, appreciating the poetic justice of the arrangement, "including several that he personally employed." Maxwell's expression shifted from concern to satisfaction. "A masterful solution. He gets his formal participation without the ability to control the narrative, and we maintain the integrity of the UNESCO presentation without creating diplomatic complications." This approach reflected how our strategies had evolved over 15 years, no longer simply reactive to threats, but proactively managing potential disruptions through sophisticated redirection rather than direct confrontation. The same methodical, documentation-focused approach that had allowed us to reclaim Blackwater now infused all aspects of the Institute's operations. As preparations for the UNESCO delegation continued throughout the day, I found a quiet moment to walk the grounds of Blackwater Estate alone. The late afternoon sunlight illuminated the restored architecture, casting long shadows across gardens now meticulously maintained according to Julian's original designs. The transformation was complete yet ongoing, each generation of preservation fellows adding new insights to the methodologies we had pioneered, each protected property extending the impact of what had begun as a personal battle to save one historic estate. Near the memorial garden dedicated to Julian's vision, I encountered Terence Finley, Victor's uncle who had reconnected with the family after Corinne's downfall. Now in his 80s, he remained actively involved with the Institute's oral history program, documenting the personal stories connected to historic properties throughout the region. "Thinking about tomorrow's UNESCO visit?" he asked, joining me on the stone bench overlooking Julian's favorite view of the estate. "Partly," I acknowledged, "but also reflecting on how completely Blackwater has transformed from what Corinne intended, from a private possession to be controlled to an international resource to be shared." Terence nodded thoughtfully. "Julian always said Blackwater wasn't meant to be a monument frozen in time, but a living demonstration of how the past could inform the future. I think he would be astonished by how literally his vision has been realized. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't discovered those first discrepancies in the financial records," I mused. "If I hadn't spent those years methodically documenting Corinne's manipulation before confronting her. Blackwater would likely be a boutique hotel now, Terrence said bluntly. The North Wing converted to luxury suites, the historical features gradually replaced with modern amenities, the Preservation Trust depleted to fund commercial ventures. He was right, of course. Without the patient documentation that had exposed Corinne's manipulation, Blackwater's transformation would have followed a very different trajectory. What had begun as my professional instinct to investigate architectural discrepancies had evolved into a methodology now being adopted by preservation specialists worldwide. The following morning brought the UNESCO delegation, an impressive assembly of heritage preservation experts from around the world, accompanied by diplomats, foundation representatives, and international media. The formal evaluation would determine whether the Valerian preservation methodology would be officially endorsed as a UNESCO-recommended approach for protecting vulnerable historic properties globally. As predicted, Lawrence Westbrook appeared, with the State Department representatives, his attempt to insert himself into Blackwater's narrative as transparent as it was inappropriate. Following our strategy, he was smoothly directed to the legal documentation presentation group, a decision he could hardly protest without revealing his specific concerns about that particular topic. The UNESCO visit unfolded over 2 days of detailed presentations, site tours, and technical demonstrations. The delegation examined every aspect of the Institute's work, from the physical restoration techniques pioneered in Blackwater's North Wing to the digital archives documenting thousands of at-risk properties worldwide. Of particular interest was the Institute's approach to community engagement, ensuring that historic preservation served the needs of local populations rather than displacing them. The Henderson family from Sycamore Street presented their experience as a case study, describing how the Valerian methodology had allowed them to maintain ownership of their historic Victorian while addressing structural issues that would otherwise have forced its sale and likely demolition. Before the Valerian initiative, preservation was often seen as an elite concern, Mrs. Henderson explained to the assembled delegates. Something that happened to communities rather than with them. The methodology developed here at Blackwater changed that paradigm completely, making preservation a collaborative process that serves both architectural heritage and community needs. This transformation in approach had perhaps been our most significant contribution to the field. Traditional preservation efforts had often prioritized buildings over the people who inhabited them, creating patterns of gentrification that displaced original communities. The Valerian methodology explicitly addressed this issue, integrating community retention strategies into all preservation planning. During the technical presentations, I noticed Lawrence Westbrook sitting uncomfortably through the detailed explanation of forensic documentation techniques for exposing ownership manipulation, the very methods that had revealed his and Corinne's attempt to divert Blackwater's Preservation Trust. His presence in that particular session created an unspoken but powerful demonstration of the methodology's effectiveness. The culmination of the UNESCO visit was a formal presentation in Blackwater's Grand Hall, the same space where, 15 years earlier, Corinne had orchestrated the birthday celebration that became the catalyst for her downfall. Now, instead of Boston's social elite gathered for a carefully controlled spectacle, the hall hosted preservation specialists from around the world engaged in substantive discussion about protecting cultural heritage. The head of the UNESCO delegation, Dr. Amara Okafor, addressed the assembled group with evident appreciation. What we have witnessed these past 2 days represents a paradigm shift in preservation methodology. The Valerian approach demonstrates that architectural heritage protection is not merely about maintaining physical structures, but about documenting and securing the legal, financial, and community frameworks that enable those structures to survive and thrive. She turned to acknowledge Victor and me. Most significantly, this institute has transformed a personal victory, the protection of a single estate from inappropriate development, into a global resource. The methodologies pioneered here at Blackwater are already protecting vulnerable historic properties across 5 continents. The formal endorsement that followed would establish the Valyrian methodology as the international standard for identifying and addressing threats to historic properties, particularly those facing ownership disputes or legal vulnerabilities. What had begun as my strategy for exposing Corinne's manipulation would now guide preservation efforts worldwide. After the delegates departed, Victor and I found ourselves alone in Julian's study, the evening light filtering through the windows his grandfather had designed to capture the sunset's glow on the surrounding hills. 15 years, Victor said, quietly. From lying in a hospital bed reading Mother's letter about your belongings being removed from Blackwater to hosting a UNESCO delegation endorsing our methodology as an international standard. Not exactly what she had planned when she tried to have you erased from the estate. The ultimate irony, I agreed, is that her attempt to remove me became the catalyst for everything that followed. Without that moment, the physical attack at my birthday party, the hospitalization, her letter, we might never have exposed the full extent of her manipulation. Patient documentation vindicated by perfect timing, Victor observed, the approach that saved Blackwater now saving historic properties worldwide. The phrase captured the essence of what had evolved from our experience, not just specific preservation techniques but a philosophical approach that valued methodical evidence, gathering over impulsive confrontation, strategic timing over immediate reaction. Later that evening, a small celebration gathered in Blackwater's library. Not the formal diplomatic reception that had concluded the UNESCO visit, but an intimate acknowledgement with those who had been part of the journey from the beginning. Vivian Pascal, Daphne Carter, Maxwell Hargrove, Terence Finley, Eleanor Winters, each had played a crucial role in Blackwater's transformation. I remember when this room was off limits to anyone but family, Terence recalled, gesturing to the library where we had gathered. Corinne treated the entire estate as a private kingdom rather than a historic resource. Now it hosts researchers from around the world, Eleanor noted. The textile conservation techniques we've developed here are being applied to historic collections from Edinburgh to Kyoto. And the legal protection frameworks have been adapted for heritage sites across 6 different legal systems, Maxwell added with evident satisfaction. What worked for Blackwater now works for properties facing similar threats worldwide. As conversations continued around us, Victor drew me aside to a quiet corner of the library. "I've been meaning to show you something," he said, retrieving an old leather portfolio from a shelf. The archivists found this in a collection of grandfather's personal papers we hadn't fully cataloged yet. Inside was a series of architectural sketches, Julian's original vision for Blackwater as an educational center for preservation studies. The drawings, dated nearly 30 years earlier, showed remarkably prescient plans for converting various sections of the estate into teaching spaces, research facilities, and conservation laboratories. "He saw all of this decades ago," Victor said wonderingly. "Not just preserving Blackwater as a historic property, but transforming it into a living center for teaching preservation techniques. And Corinne fought that vision every step of the way," I observed, tracing the careful lines of Julian's drawings. Seeing the estate only as something to control rather than something to share. The ultimate irony is that her attempts to prevent this transformation became the catalyst that made it possible, Victor noted. Without her manipulation being exposed so completely, we might never have gained the legal authority or financial resources to realize grandfather's full vision. This paradox lay at the heart of Blackwater's story, how attempts to control through deception had ultimately enabled unprecedented openness and education. Corinne's meticulous efforts to maintain exclusive control had instead created the conditions for global sharing of preservation methodologies. The following week brought the formal notification that UNESCO had officially endorsed the Valyrian preservation methodology as a recommended approach for identifying and addressing threats to vulnerable historic properties worldwide. The announcement included funding for translations of all training materials into 12 languages and the establishment of regional training centers on 3 continents. As I reviewed the implementation plan with the Institute's international program directors, I was struck by how completely the approach had evolved from its origins. What had begun as my personal strategy for documenting Corinne's manipulation of Blackwater's ownership had developed into a systematic methodology applicable across widely varying cultural and legal contexts. The core principles remained consistent: patient documentation rather than premature confrontation, comprehensive evidence gathering rather than piecemeal challenges, strategic timing rather than reactive engagement. These approaches, developed through necessity during my investigation of Corinne's manipulation, now formed the foundation of an internationally recognized preservation methodology. That afternoon, as preservation fellows from 3 continents participated in a workshop on documenting legal vulnerabilities in historic property protection, I observed from the back of the room how naturally they applied these principles to case studies from their home regions. A preservation specialist from Jordan adapted the evidence-gathering protocols to address ownership disputes affecting an ancient caravanserai. A Japanese architectural historian applied the documentation methodology to establish construction chronology for a temple complex with contested provenance. The methodology that had saved Blackwater from inappropriate development was now protecting historic properties facing similar threats worldwide, each adaptation strengthening and refining the approach through application to new contexts. After the workshop concluded, I found Victor in the North Wing Conservation Laboratory, where advanced imaging technology was being used to document deterioration patterns in historic building materials. Once slated for conversion to a boutique hotel under Corinne's plans, this section of Blackwater now housed some of the most sophisticated preservation technology in the world. The implementation team needs final approval on the international training schedule, I informed him, presenting the detailed rollout plan for the UNESCO-endorsed methodology. The first sessions begin next month in Paris, Rome, and Kyoto, with additional locations added quarterly. Victor reviewed the materials with evident satisfaction. From one estate to a global movement, he observed. Not what Mother had in mind when she ordered your belongings packed while you were in the hospital. The ultimate backfire, I agreed. Her attempt to control Blackwater through manipulation created the conditions for it to become an international resource beyond any individual's ownership. This transformation represented the true victory, not merely reclaiming Blackwater from Corinne's deception, but expanding its significance far beyond what either she or we had initially imagined. The estate that had once been jealously controlled now freely shared its resources, methodologies, and knowledge with preservation specialists worldwide. That evening, a call came from Maxwell Hargrove with unexpected news. Lawrence Westbrook has issued a public statement, he reported. Apparently, attending the legal documentation session during the UNESCO visit affected him more deeply than we anticipated. Lawrence's statement acknowledged his role in the attempted destruction of Blackwater's historic features and the manipulation of its ownership records. More significantly, he had established a substantial fund to support the implementation of the Valerian methodology specifically in regions where historic properties faced threats from commercial development. He's calling it the Accountability and Preservation Fund, Maxwell explained, with explicit acknowledgement that his own actions at Blackwater represent exactly the kind of threat the methodology was designed to expose and counteract. This unexpected development created complex emotions, particularly for Victor. Lawrence had been Corinne's willing accomplice in the manipulation of Blackwater's finances and Victor's psychological conditioning. His late-life attempt at redemption couldn't erase those actions, but it did represent a form of acknowledgement that had been notably absent in Corinne's case until her final illness. I don't know if I can forgive him, Victor said thoughtfully when we discussed the development, but I can acknowledge that using his resources to implement the methodology globally represents a form of restitution with real-world impact. The fund will allow implementation in regions that couldn't otherwise afford the training and technology, I noted, particularly in developing countries where historic properties are most vulnerable to unregulated development. Which means Lawrence's former expertise in dismantling historic protection will now fund its expansion, Victor observed with ironic appreciation. Another example of manipulation ultimately strengthening the very things it attempted to destroy. This pattern of reversal, attempts at control creating the conditions for unprecedented openness, had defined Blackwater's transformation from contested inheritance to international resource. Corinne's meticulous efforts to maintain exclusive ownership had instead catalyzed the development of methodologies now freely shared worldwide. 1 month later, I stood in the Grand Hall of Blackwater Estate, addressing the first cohort of International Preservation Fellows selected for advanced training in the Valyrian methodology. 60 specialists from 28 countries, architects, historians, conservationists, legal experts, gathered to learn the approach that had transformed one estate's protection into a global movement. The methodology you will learn here began with a simple principle, I explained to the assembled specialists. That patient documentation is often more powerful than immediate confrontation when addressing threats to historic properties. That comprehensive evidence gathering, strategically deployed at precisely the right moment, can overcome even the most entrenched opposition to preservation. I gestured to the room around us, once the stage for Corinne's carefully orchestrated social performances, now a vibrant educational space filled with preservation specialists from around the world. This very hall represents that principle in action. 15 years ago, it was the setting for a confrontation that could have resulted in Blackwater's historic features being lost forever. Instead, because of years of methodical documentation preceding that moment, it became the catalyst for a transformation that has protected not just this estate, but hundreds of historic properties worldwide. The fellows listened attentively, many taking notes as I outlined the core principles they would master during their residency at the Institute. The documentation protocols for establishing authentic provenance, the legal frameworks for addressing ownership vulnerabilities, the community engagement strategies for ensuring preservation served local populations rather than displacing them. The most powerful lesson of Blackwater's transformation, I concluded, is that preservation isn't achieved through control, but through strategic openness. Not through restricting access, but through expanding engagement. The methodologies you learn here aren't proprietary secrets, but resources meant to be adapted, applied, and shared to protect vulnerable historic properties in your own regions. As the formal presentation concluded and the fellows broke into specialized working groups, I found myself reflecting on how completely Blackwater had evolved from what Corinne had envisioned. The estate she had sought to control through deception now freely shared its resources with preservation specialists from around the world. The methodologies developed to expose her manipulation now protected historic properties across 5 continents. Later that day, I joined a small group of fellows during their documentation exercise in what had once been Corinne's private wing of the house, sections that she had kept rigidly off-limits during her tenure as Blackwater's self-appointed guardian. Now these spaces housed digital archives cataloging thousands of at-risk historic properties worldwide, their architectural features and legal vulnerabilities meticulously documented using the methodology pioneered at Blackwater. A preservation fellow from Thailand approached with a question about adapting the evidence-gathering protocols to properties with complex religious ownership structures. As we discussed the necessary modifications to address her specific regional context, I was struck by how naturally the methodology lent itself to adaptation across widely varying cultural and legal frameworks. The principle remains consistent, I explained, even as the specific techniques are modified to suit local conditions. Patient documentation before engagement, comprehensive evidence gathering before challenge, strategic timing rather than reactive confrontation. These core approaches, developed through necessity during my investigation of Corinne's manipulation of Blackwater, now formed the foundation of preservation efforts worldwide. Each adaptation strengthened the methodology through application to new contexts, creating a continuously evolving approach rooted in Blackwater's experience but expanding far beyond it. That evening, as twilight settled over the estate grounds, I walked the perimeter path Julian had established decades earlier. The path that had once provided him solitary reflection now guided international visitors through carefully restored gardens and architectural features, each element protected through the methodology that bore Blackwater's regional name. Victor joined me as I paused near the memorial garden dedicated to Julian's vision. "The first satellite training center opens in Rome next week," he remarked, "Paris and Kyoto the week after. By this time next year, preservation specialists on 4 continents will be implementing the methodology. From one estate to a global movement," I repeated our now familiar observation. "Not what your mother intended when she had my belongings packed while I was hospitalized." "The ultimate irony," Victor agreed, "is that her attempt to erase your presence from Blackwater created the conditions that made all of this possible. Without that catalytic moment, her letter, the confrontation in the hospital room, the exposure of her manipulation, we might never have developed the methodology now protecting historic properties worldwide. This fundamental reversal attempts at control, creating the conditions for unprecedented openness, defined Blackwater's transformation. Corinne's meticulous efforts to maintain exclusive ownership had instead catalyzed the development of methodologies now freely shared across cultural and national boundaries. As night fell and lights illuminated Blackwater's facade, I reflected on how completely the estate had been transformed from a private possession jealously controlled by one family to an international resource serving preservation specialists worldwide. The house that Corinne had treated as her personal kingdom now welcomed visitors from around the globe, sharing the methodologies and knowledge developed through its protection. When my mother-in-law threw my things out while I was in the hospital, she couldn't have imagined that her attempt to erase my presence would instead become the catalyst for Blackwater's transformation into something far beyond her limited vision. From contested inheritance to International Preservation Institute, from private control to global resource, from exclusion to education. The patient documentation that had exposed Corinne's manipulation now protected vulnerable historic properties worldwide. The methodical approach that had reclaimed Blackwater from inappropriate development now guided preservation specialists across 5 continents. Sometimes the most effective response to attempted erasure isn't immediate confrontation, but strategic. Preparation, gathering evidence, building alliances, and waiting for the perfect moment when deception becomes its own undoing. What had begun as my professional instinct to investigate architectural discrepancies had evolved into a methodology now recognized as the international standard for protecting vulnerable historic properties. And perhaps that was the most meaningful vindication of all, not merely reclaiming what Corinne had attempted to take away, but transforming it into something that would continue to protect architectural heritage long after our individual stories had faded into Blackwater's continuing history. 20 years after reclaiming Blackwater Estate, I found myself standing before the United Nations General Assembly in New York, addressing delegates from 193 countries about the Global Heritage Protection Accord, an international treaty based on the preservation methodology that had begun with one historic property in the Blue Ridge Mountains. "Distinguished delegates," I began, surveying the assembly of world leaders, cultural ministers, and diplomatic representatives. Heritage preservation is not merely about maintaining physical structures, but about protecting the collective memory and identity of communities worldwide. The methodology we have developed demonstrates that strategic documentation, community engagement, and legal fortification can protect vulnerable historic properties even against the most determined opposition. The journey from Blackwater's contested inheritance to this international podium represented a transformation beyond anything I could have imagined when I first discovered discrepancies in Julian Finley's financial records 2 decades earlier. What had begun as my strategy for exposing Corinne's manipulation had evolved into an approach now being codified in international law. The Global Heritage Protection Accord represented a landmark achievement, establishing binding protections for historic properties while creating mechanisms for technical assistance, financial support, and legal intervention when preservation was threatened. At its core lay the principles pioneered at Blackwater: meticulous documentation, strategic timing, and comprehensive evidence gathering. After my address, the Assembly moved to formal consideration of the accord. Nation after nation rose to express support, many citing specific historic properties in their regions that had already been saved through application of the Valerian methodology. The delegate from Jordan described how documentation protocols had protected an ancient desert caravanserai from inappropriate development. The Italian representative explained how evidence-gathering techniques had exposed fraudulent ownership, claims threatening a Renaissance palazzo in Florence. As the electronic voting board illuminated with overwhelming support for the accord, I exchanged a glance with Victor, seated among the diplomatic observers. 20 years ago, we had been fighting to protect a single estate from Corinne's manipulative control. Now that struggle had transformed into an international agreement, protecting thousands of historic properties worldwide. Following the UN session, we attended a reception hosted by the World Heritage Committee, where preservation specialists from around the globe gathered to celebrate the accord's passage. Dr. Amara Okafor, who had led the UNESCO delegation to Blackwater years earlier and now chaired the World Heritage Committee, raised a toast. "From one historic property to an international treaty," she declared, echoing our own private observation over the years. The Valerian methodology demonstrates how strategic documentation and community engagement can transform preservation from a reactive effort to a proactive force for cultural protection. The following day, we met with representatives from the World Bank's Cultural Heritage Investment Program, which had adopted the Valerian economic sustainability models as requirements for heritage development funding. Their analysis had confirmed what we had demonstrated at Blackwater, that properly managed historic properties generated more sustainable economic benefits than demolition and redevelopment. "The data from your case studies has been transformative," explained Rajiv Mehta, the program's director. "By demonstrating that preservation creates more long-term economic value than redevelopment, you've changed the fundamental calculation for financial institutions evaluating heritage properties." This economic dimension had become a crucial aspect of our approach. Traditional preservation efforts had often lacked viable financial models, making them vulnerable to development pressure. The methodology developed at Blackwater integrated economic sustainability from the beginning, creating frameworks where historic properties generated sufficient revenue to fund their own maintenance while benefiting surrounding communities. As our meetings in New York concluded, I took an evening to visit the Metropolitan Museum's special exhibition, Patient Documentation: How Strategic Preservation Changed Global Heritage Protection. The exhibit traced the development of the Valerian methodology from its origins at Blackwater to its worldwide implementation, featuring case studies from 6 continents. Walking through the galleries, I observed how completely the approach had evolved from its origins. What had begun as my personal strategy for exposing Corinne's manipulation had developed into a systematic methodology applicable across widely varying cultural, economic, and legal contexts. One display particularly captured this evolution: a comparative timeline showing traditional preservation approaches alongside the Valerian methodology. Where traditional approaches often engaged in direct confrontation with development interests, frequently resulting in costly legal battles with uncertain outcomes, the Valerian approach emphasized patient documentation before engagement, comprehensive evidence gathering before challenge, and strategic timing rather than reactive confrontation. Another section showcased the economic sustainability models developed at Blackwater and now implemented worldwide. Interactive displays demonstrated how historic properties generated revenue through educational programs, appropriate adaptive, reuse, and community engagement, creating financial sustainability that protected them from development pressure. As I examined the exhibition's detailed presentation of these methodologies, I was approached by a young preservation fellow from the Valerian Institute's international program. Dr. Finley, the director sent me to remind you about tomorrow's keynote address at Columbia University. The Architectural Preservation Department has arranged special transportation to accommodate your schedule. I thanked her for the reminder, reflecting on how the Valerian Institute had grown into a global organization with hundreds of preservation fellows, regional training centers on 4 continents, and implementation programs in over 60 countries. The institute that had begun in Blackwater's restored North Wing now maintained headquarters in 7 countries, with satellite training facilities in dozens more. The following morning, I addressed a packed auditorium at Columbia University's School of Architecture, Preservation, and Planning. The audience included not only students and faculty, but preservation professionals from throughout the region, many of whom had implemented the Valerian methodology in their own projects. Effective preservation requires not just architectural expertise but strategic thinking, I explained to the assembled specialists. Understanding when to document quietly and when to engage openly. Recognizing that timing can be as crucial as technique. Approaching preservation not as a battle to be won through confrontation, but as a process to be managed through strategic evidence gathering and community engagement. After the lecture, I met with a small group of advanced preservation students who had been selected for residencies at the Valerian Institute's international training centers. Their questions reflected how completely the methodology had been integrated into preservation education worldwide. No longer an alternative approach, but the established standard for addressing threats to historic properties. The most important lesson from Blackwater's transformation, I told them as our discussion concluded, is that preservation ultimately isn't about buildings, but about stories. The physical structures matter because they embody narratives that connect communities to their past and inform their future. When we protect historic properties, we're protecting the collective memory that gives meaning to place. This philosophy, that preservation was fundamentally about protecting narratives rather than merely maintaining structures, had become central to the Valerian approach. The methodology emphasized documenting not just architectural features, but the stories connected to historic properties, ensuring that preservation served the communities whose heritage was being protected. Late that afternoon, as I prepared to return to Blackwater following the week of international engagements, I received an unexpected message from Maxwell Hargrove. Now in his 80s, our longtime legal counsel remained involved with the Institute's educational programs, teaching specialized courses on documentation standards for legal evidence in preservation cases. An interesting development, his message began. The World Bank team mentioned that Lawrence Westbrook has significantly expanded the Accountability and Preservation Fund. He's designated an additional $50 million, specifically for implementing the treaty protections in regions where historic properties face threats from climate change. This continued evolution in Lawrence's approach to restitution created complicated feelings. His role in Corinne's manipulation of Blackwater and Victor's psychological conditioning couldn't be erased by later financial contributions. Yet his resources were now protecting historic properties that might otherwise be lost to rising sea levels, increased flooding, and other climate impacts, particularly in developing regions without sufficient preservation infrastructure. It's a strange legacy, Victor observed when we discussed this development during our return flight to Blackwater. Mother never acknowledged the damage she caused, except briefly during her final illness. Lawrence at least seems to be making a genuine attempt at restitution, even if it can't erase his earlier actions. The Accountability Fund has already protected dozens of properties that would otherwise have been lost, I acknowledged. Whatever his personal motivations, the practical impact is significant. Another irony in Blackwater's story, Victor noted. Those who once threatened its destruction now fund protection for vulnerable properties worldwide. This pattern of reversal, attempts at control ultimately strengthening protection, had defined Blackwater's transformation. Corinne's meticulous efforts to maintain exclusive ownership had instead catalyzed the development of methodologies now embedded in international law. Lawrence's participation in fraudulent financial schemes now funded preservation efforts in regions most vulnerable to loss. Returning to Blackwater after the high-profile international engagements always provided a necessary grounding. Despite its evolution into the headquarters of a global institute, the estate retained its essential character as a historic property with its own unique story. The architectural features Julian had fought to protect remained intact, now serving as both teaching tools for preservation fellows and tangible connections to the estate's complex history. The day after our return, I met with Vivienne Pascal to review operations during my absence. Though officially semi-retired, she maintained an advisory role with the Institute, her institutional knowledge invaluable as operations expanded globally. The Japanese Heritage Delegation completed their specialized training program, she reported as we walked through the East Wing, now converted to advanced conservation laboratories. They've already implemented the documentation protocols at 3 historic temple complexes facing development pressure in Kyoto. And the community engagement pilot in Peru? I inquired, referencing a new program adapting the Valerian methodology to indigenous heritage sites with complex cultural ownership patterns. Exceeding expectations, Vivienne confirmed. The local implementation team has documented 5 previously unregistered sites and established community-based protection frameworks for each. The Peruvian Cultural Ministry has requested expanded training for regional preservation officers. This global implementation represented the fulfillment of what had begun as a personal battle to save one historic property. The methodology, developed through necessity at Blackwater, now protected vulnerable historic sites worldwide, each application strengthening and refining the approach through adaptation to new contexts. Later that afternoon, I joined a video conference with directors of the Valerian Institute's regional centers, preservation specialists implementing the methodology across widely varying cultural and legal frameworks. The Bangkok Center reported, "Successful intervention protecting a historic marketplace from inappropriate development." The Cairo office detailed documentation protocols being established for archaeological sites in regions with governance challenges. The Istanbul team presented community engagement strategies for historic properties in rapidly urbanizing areas. Each implementation reflected the core principles pioneered at Blackwater while adapting techniques to address specific regional contexts. The methodology had proven remarkably adaptable, effective in both established democracies with strong legal systems and developing regions with limited governmental protection for historic properties. As the conference concluded, I was reminded of a comment Dr. Okafor had made years earlier during the UNESCO evaluation. The genius of the Valerian methodology isn't in any single technique, but in its strategic framework for applying preservation principles across widely varying contexts. It provides not just tools, but a philosophy of patient strategic engagement that transcends specific cultural or legal environments. That evening, Victor and I hosted a small dinner at Blackwater for the Institute's executive committee, the team responsible for implementing the Global Heritage Protection Accord now that it had been formally adopted. The gathering included preservation specialists from 12 countries, each bringing unique expertise to the international implementation effort. The treaty provides unprecedented legal protection, noted Jürgen Kleist, the German preservation architect who headed the Institute's European operations. But its real power lies in the standardized documentation protocols that establish evidence admissible in virtually any legal system worldwide. Combined with the economic sustainability models, added Maria Santos from the Brazilian implementation team, these protections address both the legal and financial vulnerabilities that historically have made properties susceptible to inappropriate development. The conversation reflected how comprehensively the methodology had evolved from its origins in my investigation of Corinne's manipulation of Blackwater. What had begun as a personal strategy for exposing deception had developed into a systematic approach now codified in international law. After dinner, as preservation specialists from around the world gathered in what had once been Corinne's rigidly controlled formal drawing room, I found myself reflecting on how completely Blackwater had transformed from what she had envisioned. The estate she had sought to control through manipulation now freely shared its resources with preservation specialists worldwide. The methodologies developed to expose her deception now protected historic properties across 6 continents. The following morning brought a visit from representatives of the Smithsonian Institution, which was preparing a comprehensive documentation of the Valerian methodology's development and global implementation. The research team included architectural, historians, legal scholars, and digital preservation specialists, all focused on capturing both the technical aspects of the methodology and the human story of its evolution. We're particularly interested in documenting the transition from personal strategy to global methodology, explained Dr. Eliana Washington, the project's lead researcher. How approaches developed to address a specific threat to one historic's property evolved into techniques now protecting thousands of sites worldwide. This evolution had indeed been remarkable. From my professional instinct to investigate architectural discrepancies at Blackwater, to an internationally standardized methodology embedded in treaty obligations. Each stage of development had maintained the core principles: patient documentation, strategic timing, comprehensive evidence gathering. The Smithsonian team conducted extensive interviews, not just with Victor and me, but with everyone who had played a significant role in developing the methodology. Vivienne Pascal described the early documentation of financial discrepancies in Blackwater's management. Eleanor Winters recounted how textile conservation techniques pioneered at the estate had evolved into specialized approaches now protecting historic textiles worldwide. Maxwell Hargrove detailed the development of legal documentation standards that could withstand scrutiny in diverse judicial systems. What emerges from these accounts, Dr. Washington observed after several days of interviews, is a remarkable story of adaptation and evolution. What began as a strategy to address a specific threat became a comprehensive methodology applicable across widely varying contexts. Yet the core principles remained consistent throughout this evolution: patient documentation before engagement, comprehensive evidence gathering before challenge, strategic timing rather than reactive confrontation. These principles, developed through necessity during my investigation of Corinne's manipulation, had indeed remained the foundation of the approach, even as specific techniques evolved to address varying cultural, economic, and legal contexts. The methodology's adaptability across these contexts had been key to its global adoption. Later that week, I led a specialized training session for preservation attorneys, implementing the legal documentation protocols established under the Global Heritage Protection Accord. The group included legal specialists from 22 countries, each adapting the methodology to their specific judicial systems. The power of the Valerian approach in legal contexts, I explained to the assembled attorneys, lies in its emphasis on establishing comprehensive documentation before engagement. By the time preservation threats reach legal proceedings, the evidence foundation is already established in formats admissible across diverse judicial systems. This legal dimension had become increasingly sophisticated over the years, evolving from the evidence-gathering techniques used to expose Corinne's manipulation of Blackwater's ownership to standardized protocols now recognized in international law. Maxwell Hargrove had played a crucial role in this development, translating our experience into procedural frameworks applicable worldwide. After the training session, I walked the grounds of Blackwater with Daphne Carter, whose long partnership with the Institute had evolved from her early role as my ally during the original investigation. Now directing international partnerships for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, she had been instrumental in expanding the methodology's implementation across diverse preservation organizations. Sometimes I still can't believe how completely Blackwater has transformed, she remarked as we passed the North Wing, once deteriorating under Corinne's neglect, now housing advanced conservation laboratories where preservation techniques were developed and taught to specialists from around the world. From contested inheritance to international resource, I agreed, using the phrase that had become something of a shorthand for Blackwater's evolution. Not what Corinne intended when she had my belongings packed while I was hospitalized. The ultimate backfire, Daphne observed. Her attempt to control Blackwater through manipulation created the conditions for it to become something far beyond her limited vision. This fundamental reversal, attempts at control creating the conditions for unprecedented openness, had defined Blackwater's transformation. Corinne's meticulous efforts to maintain exclusive ownership had instead catalyzed the development of methodologies now freely shared across cultural and national boundaries. The following day brought a delegation from the International Council on Monuments and Sites, conducting their biennial review of the Valerian Institute's operations. Their evaluation would assess not just the effectiveness of our preservation methodologies, but their ethical implementation, ensuring that heritage protection served the needs of local communities rather than imposing external values. The Council is particularly impressed with your community engagement frameworks, noted Professor Hiroshi Tanaka, who led the evaluation team. Traditional preservation approaches often prioritized buildings over people. Your methodology explicitly addresses this issue by integrating community needs into all preservation planning. This emphasis on human impact had become increasingly central to the Valerian approach. Experience had taught us that preservation succeeded only when it served the communities whose heritage was being protected. The methodology now included sophisticated engagement strategies ensuring that historic properties remained living resources, rather than isolated monuments. Later that week, I participated in a virtual lecture series connecting the Valerian Institute with preservation programs at universities worldwide. The technology allowed simultaneous interaction with students in Beijing, Cairo, London, Mexico City, and Sydney, each implementing the methodology in their regional contexts. The most powerful aspect of the Valerian approach, I explained during the global seminar, is its adaptability across widely varying cultural and legal frameworks. The core principles remain consistent, but the specific techniques evolve to address particular regional challenges. This adaptability had been crucial to the methodology's global adoption. Rather than imposing standardized techniques regardless of context, the approach provided a strategic framework within which preservationists could develop regionally appropriate implementations. The result was not uniform application, but consistent effectiveness across diverse environments. As the international engagement continued, I maintained my connection to Blackwater itself, the historic property where everything had begun. Despite the Institute's global expansion, the estate remained both our headquarters and a living demonstration of the methodology in action. Its architectural features, meticulously documented and restored, served as teaching tools for preservation, fellows from around the world. One morning, I took time to walk alone through the gardens Julian had designed decades earlier. Though now integrated into the Institute's educational programs, these spaces retained their essential character as places of reflection and connection to Blackwater's complex history. Near the memorial garden dedicated to Julian's vision, I encountered a group of new preservation fellows on their orientation tour. These early career specialists from 12 countries represented the newest generation implementing the Valerian methodology, many born after the events that had shaped Blackwater's transformation. Dr. Finley, the orientation leader, acknowledged, with evident respect, Perhaps you could share a few words about the origins of the methodology these fellows will be implementing. Facing these young preservationists, I was struck by how the approach developed through my personal experience had transcended its origins to become a professional standard taught in universities worldwide. The methodology you'll be learning began with a simple principle, I explained to the assembled fellows. That patient documentation is often more powerful than immediate confrontation when addressing threats to historic properties. That comprehensive evidence gathering, strategically deployed at precisely the right moment, can overcome even the most entrenched opposition to preservation. I gestured to Blackwater itself, its restored architecture now serving as both demonstration and teaching facility. This estate embodies that principle. 20 years ago, it faced threats that could have destroyed its historic character forever. Instead, because of methodical documentation preceding strategic action, it became not just protected itself, but the catalyst for a methodology now protecting historic properties worldwide. The fellows listened attentively, many taking notes, as I outlined the core principles they would master during their residency. None had personal knowledge of the specific events that had shaped Blackwater's transformation, Corinne's manipulation, Victor's psychological conditioning, my hospital confrontation that exposed decades of deception. For them, these were historical, case studies rather than lived experience. Yet the principles derived from that experience now guided their professional practice. Patient documentation before engagement, comprehensive evidence gathering before challenge, strategic timing rather than reactive confrontation. What had begun as my necessary approach to a personal threat had evolved into standardized methodology taught to preservation specialists worldwide. Later that day, I reviewed the implementation schedule for the Global Heritage Protection Accord with the Institute's international program directors. The treaty's ratification had triggered comprehensive programs establishing documentation protocols, legal protection frameworks, and economic sustainability models for vulnerable historic properties worldwide. The regional training centers are prepared for expanded operations, reported Sofia Mendoza, who directed the Institute's Latin American programs. Implementation teams are already working with preservation authorities in 17 countries to establish standardized documentation protocols under the treaty provisions. The Legal Assistance Program has received requests from 32 countries, added Dmitry Volkov, head of the Institute's legal division, particularly in regions where historic properties face immediate threats from development pressure or governance challenges. This global implementation represented the fulfillment of what had begun as a personal strategy for protecting one historic property. The methodology developed through necessity at Blackwater now guided preservation efforts worldwide, each application strengthening and refining the approach through adaptation to new contexts. That evening, Victor and I hosted a reception for the Institute's global leadership team, the preservation specialists responsible for implementing the methodology across 6 continents. As twilight settled over Blackwater's gardens, conversations in multiple languages filled spaces once rigidly controlled by Corinne's manipulation. It's remarkable to think how completely this place has transformed, observed Dr. Amara Okafor, who had led the original UNESCO evaluation years earlier and now served on the Institute's International Advisory Board. From a privately controlled estate to a global resource for preservation methodology. Not what my mother intended when she ordered Margot's belongings packed while she was hospitalized, Victor noted with the ironic appreciation that had become our customary acknowledgement of this fundamental reversal. The ultimate backfire, Dr. Okafor agreed. Her attempt to control Blackwater through manipulation created the conditions for it to become something far beyond her limited vision. This transformation represented the true victory, not merely reclaiming Blackwater from Corinne's deception, but expanding its significance far beyond what either she or we had initially imagined. The estate that had once been jealously controlled now freely shared its resources, methodologies, and knowledge with preservation specialists worldwide. As the reception continued into the evening, I found a moment alone on the terrace overlooking the gardens Julian had designed. The lights illuminating Blackwater's facade highlighted architectural features once threatened with demolition under Corinne's development plans, now meticulously restored and protected in perpetuity. The contrast between what might have been and what had actually manifested could hardly have been more profound. Had Corinne's manipulation remained unexposed, Blackwater would likely be unrecognizable now, its historic features compromised by inappropriate development, its significance reduced to commercial exploitation, its story distorted by deception. Instead, patient documentation had revealed the truth of both its architectural significance and the deception threatening its preservation. Strategic timing had transformed a moment of apparent defeat, my hospitalization and Corinne's attempt to remove me from the estate, into the catalyst for comprehensive exposure and protection. As preservation specialists from around the world continued their conversations in what had once been Corinne's rigidly controlled domain, I reflected on how completely her intentions had been reversed. Her attempt to erase my presence from Blackwater had instead created the conditions for transforming the estate into an international resource beyond any individual's ownership or control. When my mother-in-law threw my things out while I was in the hospital, she couldn't have imagined that her action would become the catalyst for Blackwater's evolution into something far beyond her limited vision. From contested inheritance to International Preservation Institute, from private control to global resource, from exclusion to education, the patient documentation that had exposed Corinne's manipulation now protected vulnerable historic properties. Worldwide, the methodical approach that had reclaimed Blackwater from inappropriate development now guided preservation specialists across 6 continents. The strategic timing that had transformed apparent defeat into decisive victory now formed the foundation of an internationally recognized methodology. Sometimes the most effective response to attempted erasure isn't immediate confrontation, but methodical preparation, gathering evidence, building alliances, and waiting for the perfect moment when deception becomes its own undoing. What had begun as my professional instinct to investigate architectural discrepancies had evolved into an approach now embedded in international law, and perhaps that was the most meaningful legacy of all, not merely reclaiming what Corinne had attempted to take away, but transforming it into something that would continue to protect architectural heritage long after our individual stories had faded into Blackwater's continuing history. 25 years to the day after I woke in Meridian General Hospital to find Corinne's letter, informing me my belongings had been removed from Blackwater, Victor and I stood in the grand hall of the newly completed Valerian Heritage Center in Paris. The modernist glass structure, built to complement the historic district it served, represented the newest chapter in what had become a global preservation movement. "They've integrated the documentation archives beautifully," Victor observed, examining the central exhibition where interactive displays allowed visitors to explore the evolution of the Valerian methodology from its origins at Blackwater to its current global implementation. "The transition from physical to digital is seamless," I agreed, watching as a group of architectural students accessed preservation case studies through transparent interfaces that maintained visibility of the historic streetscape beyond. The Paris Center was the 7th and most ambitious of the international facilities established to implement the Global Heritage Protection Accord. Unlike the regional training centers focused primarily on education, this facility served as a public interface, making the methodology accessible to visitors while demonstrating how heritage preservation enhanced rather than inhibited contemporary life. As honorary directors for the opening ceremonies, Victor and I had spent the week meeting with preservation specialists, government officials, and community representatives. The multi-day program culminated in tonight's gala celebration, bringing together key figures from the preservation world alongside representatives from communities whose heritage had been protected through the Valerian approach. "Dr. Finley, a moment of your time?" The center's director approached with an elderly gentleman using a walking cane. Monsieur Beaumont specifically requested an introduction. His family home in Provence was one of the first European properties protected using your methodology. Jean-Paul Beaumont, now in his 90s, clasped my hand with surprising strength. "You do not know me, madame, but your work saved my family's legacy," he said in accented English. 5 generations we lived in our maison, but developers had found ways to force us out through legal manipulation. Your documentation protocols exposed their methods and established our true ownership. This personal connection to our work never failed to move me. Behind every preserved historic property were human stories, families whose heritage had been protected, communities whose cultural identity had been maintained. The methodology merely provided tools, I responded. The preservation itself happened because people like you valued your heritage enough to fight for it. But without proper tools, even the most determined effort may fail, he replied with a gentle smile. My grandchildren now live in the house, the 7th generation. They operate a small museum on the ground floor, teaching visitors about traditional lavender cultivation. This would not exist without your work. These direct impacts had multiplied thousands of times over the years as the Valerian methodology spread globally. What had begun as a strategy to protect one historic property from inappropriate development had evolved into an approach now preserving architectural heritage worldwide. Later that evening, as the formal reception filled the center's grand hall, with conversations in dozens of languages, I found a quiet moment in the exhibition area dedicated to Blackwater's transformation. The display traced the estate's evolution from contested inheritance to international resource, using it as a case study in how preservation methodologies developed for specific threats could expand to address broader challenges. It still feels surreal sometimes, Victor said, joining me before a large photograph showing Blackwater as it appeared today, its restored architecture serving both as the Institute's headquarters and as a living demonstration of the methodology in action. Seeing our personal struggle presented as a historic case study. History happens one day at a time, I observed. We were just focused on protecting Blackwater from your mother's manipulation. The global impact evolved organically as the methodology proved effective in wider contexts. Victor nodded thoughtfully. From one woman documenting financial discrepancies to an international treaty protecting thousands of historic properties. Who could have predicted that outcome when Mother ordered your belongings packed while you were hospitalized? This fundamental reversal, how attempts at control had created the conditions for unprecedented expansion, remained the defining irony of Blackwater's story. Corinne's meticulous efforts to maintain exclusive ownership had instead catalyzed the development of methodologies now freely shared across cultural and national boundaries. The next morning brought the final event of our Paris visit, a roundtable discussion with graduate students from preservation programs worldwide. These young specialists represented the future of the field, many already implementing aspects of the Valerian methodology in their research and fieldwork. Dr. Finley, you've emphasized that preservation is ultimately about protecting stories, not just structures, began a student from the Architectural Conservation Program at Edinburgh University. How did this narrative-focused approach evolve from what began as a very personal struggle over a single historic property? The question cut to the heart of the methodology's evolution, how a strategy developed through necessity had expanded into a philosophical approach to preservation. Worldwide, the narrative dimension emerged directly from our experience at Blackwater, I explained. We discovered that the estate's architectural significance couldn't be separated from the human story of its development, contested ownership, and eventual protection. The physical structures mattered because they embodied narratives that connected communities across generations. This recognition changed our entire approach, I continued. Rather than focusing exclusively on architectural features, we began documenting the stories connected to historic properties, how they shaped community identity, how they carried cultural memory across time. This narrative dimension proved remarkably consistent across different cultures and regions, even as specific architectural traditions varied widely. The discussion expanded to include implementation challenges in different cultural contexts, how the methodology adapted to varying legal systems, economic conditions, and social structures. Throughout these variations, the core principles remained consistent: patient documentation before engagement, comprehensive evidence gathering before challenge, strategic timing rather than reactive confrontation. As the session concluded, a student from the University of Cape Town posed the question that often emerged when discussing Blackwater's transformation. Given what you know now about the global impact of the methodology, would you have approached the original situation differently? I considered the question carefully before responding. The core approach, patient documentation rather than premature confrontation, developed through necessity, not strategy. Had I confronted Corinne directly when I first discovered discrepancies, without comprehensive evidence, Blackwater would likely have been lost. What might have been different, I acknowledged, was recognizing earlier how broadly applicable this approach could be beyond our specific situation. The methodology remained somewhat intuitive until preservation specialists began formalizing it for wider implementation. That systematic development might have happened sooner had we recognized the broader applications. Victor added his perspective. The personal dimension shouldn't be overlooked either. My mother's manipulation and my own psychological conditioning created specific challenges that shaped the methodology's development. The documentation approach evolved partly because direct confrontation wasn't immediately viable given those psychological dynamics. This human dimension had indeed been crucial to the methodology's evolution. The approach developed at Blackwater hadn't emerged in a theoretical vacuum, but through practical necessity, addressing not just architectural threats, but the human deception behind them. Following the student session, Victor and I took a few hours to walk through the historic district surrounding the Valerian Center. The neighborhood represented exactly the kind of heritage the methodology had been designed to protect. Architecturally significant, but vulnerable to development pressure due to its prime location. The center's placement here was deliberate. I noted as we passed carefully preserved facades now housing a vibrant mix of residential, commercial, and cultural spaces, demonstrating that preservation can enhance rather than inhibit contemporary vitality. Integration rather than isolation, Victor agreed. Exactly what grandfather envisioned for Blackwater. Not a museum frozen in time, but a living resource continuing to serve changing needs. This vision of preservation as adaptive rather than static had become central to the Valerian approach. The methodology emphasized maintaining architectural integrity while allowing appropriate evolution, ensuring historic properties remained functional parts of living communities rather than isolated monuments. As evening approached, we prepared for our return to Blackwater the following day. 25 years after reclaiming the estate from Corinne's manipulation, it remained both our home and the headquarters of the institute that bore its regional name. Despite the global expansion of our work, Blackwater itself continued to anchor the methodology's development and implementation. Paris has been illuminating, Victor observed as we finished packing. Seeing the methodology implemented in such a different context highlights both its consistency and adaptability. That balance has been key to its global adoption, I agreed. The core principles remain consistent across widely varying cultural and legal frameworks, while specific techniques adapt to particular regional challenges. This combination of philosophical consistency and technical adaptability had indeed driven the methodology's international expansion. The approach provided a strategic framework within which preservationists worldwide could develop regionally appropriate implementations, maintaining effectiveness across diverse environments. Our final evening in Paris included a small dinner with the center's leadership team and key figures from European preservation organizations. The conversation naturally turned to future developments, how the methodology would continue evolving to address emerging challenges in heritage protection. Climate change presents unprecedented threats to historic properties, noted Henri Lefebvre, the center's technical director. Rising sea levels, increased flooding, more frequent extreme weather events. These impacts require new applications of the methodology. The documentation protocols are already being adapted, I explained, establishing baseline conditions more comprehensively so that climate-related deterioration can be distinguished from other factors. The legal frameworks are evolving too, addressing questions of relocation or reconstruction when physical preservation in original locations becomes impossible. This ongoing evolution ensured the methodology remained relevant to contemporary challenges, not a fixed approach but a living framework continuing to develop through practical application. What had begun as my strategy for exposing Corinne's manipulation at Blackwater had grown into an adaptable system addressing the full spectrum of threats to historic properties worldwide. The next morning, as our flight departed for home, I gazed down at Paris receding below us, the historic districts with their distinctive architecture clearly visible among more modern development. From this elevation, the pattern of preserved heritage amid contemporary growth created a visual representation of what the Valerian methodology sought to achieve. Not preventing change, but ensuring it occurred with respect for the architectural narratives that connected communities to their past. Returning to Blackwater always provided a sense of completion, reconnecting with the historic property where everything had begun. Despite its evolution into the headquarters of a global institute, the estate retained its essential character as Julian had envisioned it, a living demonstration of how preservation could honor the past while serving present needs. As we approached the familiar Blue Ridge Mountains surrounding Blackwater, I reflected on the journey that had transformed one woman's struggle to protect a single historic property into a methodology now preserving architectural heritage worldwide. The patient documentation that had exposed Corinne's manipulation, the strategic timing that had turned apparent defeat into decisive victory, the comprehensive evidence gathering that had established irrefutable truth against determined deception. These approaches, developed through necessity during my investigation of Corinne's control of Blackwater, now guided preservation specialists across 6 continents. The methodical strategy that had reclaimed one historic estate now protected thousands of vulnerable properties worldwide. The principles derived from personal experience now formed the foundation of an internationally recognized methodology. Blackwater itself had transformed from contested inheritance to global resource, from private possession to shared heritage, from exclusive control to educational center. The estate Corinne had sought to manage through manipulation now freely shared its resources with preservation specialists worldwide. The methodologies developed to expose her deception now protected historic properties across cultural and national boundaries. When my mother-in-law threw my things out while I was in the hospital, she couldn't have imagined that her attempt to erase my presence would instead become the catalyst for transforming Blackwater into something far beyond her limited vision. She had sought control. She created expansion. She had intended exclusion. She enabled education. She had planned erasure. She precipitated perpetuation. Sometimes the most effective response to attempted erasure isn't immediate confrontation, but patient preparation, gathering evidence, building alliances, and waiting for the perfect moment when deception becomes its own undoing. What had begun, as my professional instinct to investigate architectural discrepancies, had evolved into a methodology now embedded in international law and practice. As Blackwater came into view, its restored architecture gleaming in the afternoon light, I thought of all who had participated in its transformation: Vivian Pascal, Eleanor Winters, Maxwell Hargrove, Daphne Carter, Terence Finley, and the core, thousands who had since implemented the methodology worldwide. What had begun as a personal struggle had expanded through their contributions into a global movement for heritage protection. Perhaps that was the most meaningful legacy of all, not merely reclaiming what Corinne had attempted to take away, but transforming it into something that would continue to protect architectural heritage long after our individual stories had faded into Blackwater's continuing history. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.